I think the key, or the turning point, the beginning, really the beginning, but it took a long time to manifest itself. The beginning is what we call today the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is a renaissance of what? What does the word Renaissance mean? It means rediscovery. And what are they rediscovering in the Renaissance? What is Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael and the thinkers, the humanists of the Renaissance, what are they discovering? They're discovering an ancient civilization. An ancient civilization that to some extent had been buried. At least its art certainly had been buried. They're discovering a civilization of people who believed in man, in our capabilities, in our capacity to do great things, in man as a hero. They discover a civilization that portrayed that in their art, that reflected that in the kind of sculptures that they made. The sculptures are what survived. We don't know much about their painting, but the sculptures we saw, we discovered them when they started digging in the ground all over Italy. They discovered a civilization that had discovered the idea of philosophy and that had written vast philosophical works, many of which had disappeared from the West for 1,000 years and were now rediscovered, by the way, because the Christians conquered a Muslim Spain, found the libraries of Toledo and these other places and brought the books back to the West. So all somewhat accidents of history. But in the end, these ideas reached the West. And the greatest idea that they discover in this book are the ideas of reason. The idea that the human mind is capable of knowing the world, knowing reality, understanding reality. They discover the great scientific writings of the ancient Greeks. The Greeks were actually quite advanced when it came to science, not only in the stars, but medicine, beginnings of physics, the beginnings of biology. Again, all things that were dead for a long time in the West. And to the credit of the thinkers of the time, they took this seriously. And you can see it in the art. If you've ever gone to a museum and you see the art from the Middle Ages, and then you walk into the art of the room with the Renaissance, it's like you walked into a different universe. It's like the colors are different, the anatomy is different, the individuation. Suddenly in the Renaissance, people become individuals. They stop being just all they're looking the same. Stick figures, in a sense. They suddenly gain a respect for the individual, for who he is, and some extent to his mind. Now, the artists get it first, which is really interesting. The artists get it before the intellectuals, before the philosophers. They get it before the great thinkers. The artists, if you look at Leonardo, if you look at Raphael, if you look at Michelangelo, they get this perspective on human beings. They get Western civilization way before the philosophers write about it. But these ideas sped through Europe, these ideas of science, of reason. Think Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler in astronomy. Suddenly you have these geniuses. Where did they come from? They were always there, but they were suppressed, oppressed by the authorities. Suddenly they were allowed to experiment, to explore, at least to some extent, right? Galileo gets house arrest. But house arrest is better than being burned at the stake, which would have been his fate 100 years earlier. So suddenly you get a little bit of freedom. And ultimately, this period, which lasts maybe 200 years, it's a period of this rebirth, rediscovery. But at the same time, it's a period of great stress in Europe. Anybody know what's going on in Europe during these 200 years? A lot of wars, a lot of violence. In the name of what? What is the violence in the name of? Religion. You know, the most violent war in Western civilization's history, in the history of the West, is probably the 30-Year War. It's probably, in terms of the number of people who died per capita, more casualties than World War II and World War I. Something like a third to half of the German population was killed during that war. And it wasn't other people killing the Germans. It was the Germans killing the Germans. It was Catholics killing Protestants and Protestants killing Catholics. War was a huge part of life in that period of time. The thinkers coming out of that period take these ideas that they got from Greece. They look at the world around them and they see these wars. And they come to the conclusion that something new is needed. Something different is needed. Two things happen during this period. One is you get philosophers like John Locke. John Locke, he looks at Europe and he says, this is ridiculous. Protestants and Catholics killing each other, the slaughter, the bloodshed. This isn't the kind of life that's appropriate to a human being. And the idea that he develops is an idea, no, individuals have rights. Individuals have a right to their own life. Individuals have a right to live their lives based on their own values. The state, the authorities, even the church doesn't have a right to dictate to individuals how to live their life. This is a revolution in thinking. It's a revolution that's being developing, in a sense, was already in the art before, but is now being put on paper, right? And of course, John Locke spends a little time in jail and has to escape England to go to the Netherlands because these ideas are difficult. Remember, this is pre-free speech. This is before the idea of free speech. There's no free speech. Voltaire, during the same period, has to escape to Geneva. So this is a period of a lot of new ideas, formats, and maybe the most important thing of this period is Isaac Newton, of all people. The scientist, the physicist. Because what Isaac Newton says is, before that, the idea that reason is good, reason is efficacious, is yeah, that's cool, okay, what does that give me? But Isaac Newton shows us that through reason we can explain the physical world. Really explain the physical world. And explain it in a way that's accessible to almost anyone. If you took a physics class in high school or in college and didn't understand Newton's rules of motion, you had a bad teacher. They're not hard. This is relatively simple stuff. Certainly, if you've ever taken a class in quantum mechanics or in Einstein, then that's unknowable. This is knowable to almost anybody. And Europeans took it that way. Americans took it that way. Americans still were a colony at that point. But they took this as, whoa, we can understand the physical world. Now, in contrast to what? In the past, how did we know what was true and what was not? What was the standard of truth before Newton? Does it match the Bible or doesn't it? Does it match Aristotle or doesn't it? They took Aristotle as like the Bible. Like Aristotle was a scientist. He got 90% of it wrong. Method was right, which is the most important thing. But his actual observations, his actually physical theories about the world, biological theories were wrong. But what's important is the method, right? That's how you correct the mistakes. If you have the method right, you correct the mistakes. They took Aristotle as the truth. And yet suddenly, they were discovering things that Aristotle didn't say, that Aristotle was wrong, that contradicted the Bible. This is why Galileo had to be in house arrest, right? And suddenly, the standard for truth was not ancient books. The standard for truth was the human mind. The standard for truth was science, was observation, was discovering things in reality. Suddenly, people, individuals, common people, suddenly had this sense of efficaciousness. We have a mind. Whoa. That's pretty cool. Because before that, who made all the choices for you? Like for most people. Like we romanticize the past, so we have movies, but the movies are always about aristocrats. Always. Because you don't want to know how the peasants lived. Right? You're not going to go watch a movie about that. Like, who decided what your profession was 300 years ago? Like, literally for everybody, who decided what your profession was? You did if you were a man, because if you're a woman, it's irrelevant. Because you had no choices if you were a woman, zero. If you were a man, you did what your father did. You joined the guild. You know the story of, it's a funny story about Leonardo da Vinci. You know Leonardo da Vinci? Like he got to be an artist and an engineer and a strategist and hung around with all kinds of people. You know what his father did? He was a notary. So how come Leonardo da Vinci didn't become a notary? He should have joined the guild and become a notary like his dad. That was the law. How did he get the freedom to go out and do all this fun stuff? Anybody know? He was a bastard. He was an illegitimate child. As an illegitimate child, he couldn't join the guild. So he was freer than the legitimate child. The legitimate child would have had to join the guild. He got to go and do all this fun stuff. That's not a healthy society, right? Who did you get to choose who to marry? For the most part, no. Do you get to choose your political leader? No. And there's a reason for that. Because if you take away human reason, if you say people don't have reason, if you say people have to abide by an authority, a philosopher king, according to Plato, the religious authority, according to our religions, then you're basically saying you can't make decisions for yourself. You don't have the capacity to think for yourself. You have to follow a leader. And, we've had lots of different authorities, but it's always an authority. What Isaac Newton and John Locke do is they liberate the individual's capacity to think for himself. They say, no, you have reason. You can think for yourself. You can choose for yourself. You can discover truth. You're not reliant on these authorities to discover truth. Truth is accessible to every human being. And suddenly people wake up and say, wait a minute. If that's the case, why can't I choose my own profession? Why can't I start my own business? This is where entrepreneurship comes from. Why can't I do my own invention without asking for permission? Why can't I move cities? One of the things characteristic, again, of life before was this idea of you were born somewhere, you stayed there. Travel was very difficult and hard, but people never moved. The whole idea of immigration, which I know is controversial today, but hey, all of your ancestors were immigrants one way or the other. Some point, immigration was okay in the United States. Immigration was unheard of. Nobody moved. Suddenly, you could do that. You could live your life based on your own mind because you had one. Before, there was no mind. This period, which starts at about 1670, 1680, and ends, I would say, right at the beginning of the French Revolution, or maybe in the first guillotine of the French Revolution, is called what? Anybody know what that name of that period is? It's the Enlightenment, but it has another name. It's called the Age of Reason. There's a reason it's called the Age of Reason, because it's the age that elevates man's reason as our means of knowing the world. And the achievements during this period of time, this is the period of time in which we get all the innovations that we today accept and take for granted. We get the political thinkers thinking about liberty and freedom. We get the political thinkers thinking about the economics of freedom. Think about Adam Smith and Hume as an economist. He's a great economist thinking about freedom from an economic perspective. And the crowning achievement of the Enlightenment politically. What's the crowning achievement of the Enlightenment from a political perspective? What is the greatest achievement of the Enlightenment? The Constitution, or put it more broadly, the creation of the United States of America. I would argue the greatest document is not the Constitution, but the Declaration. Declaration of Independence, which I think is the greatest document, political document ever written, by far. Nothing comes close. Because what does the Declaration announce to the world? That all men are created equal. Equal in what sense? Like we all have the same income. We all have the same abilities. We all have the same rights. We're equal before the law. But not just equal before any law, before the law that is based on the idea of rights. We all have the right. Inalienable. Inalienable means what? Nobody can take it away from you. 99% of the people can vote. They still can't take it away from you. It's you. It's part of you. It's part of your nature. And every single human being, they say, all men are created equal. Not all Americans are created equal, just by the way. All men are created equal. And by men here, we want to include women, right? But all are created equal. And they have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It would be nice if they kept property in there. It would have made things a little cleaner. But they didn't. Yeah, but they didn't, unfortunately. But it's still there. What does it mean to say you have a right? What did John Locke mean when he said you had a right? What did the founders mean you had a right to something? Because today, people think we have a right to free health care and free education and maybe free food and free anything we feel like. Is that what the founders thought rights meant? What did rights mean? Yeah, but a right to life means what? I mean, I could say, look, I'm sick. My right to life means that you have to provide me with health care for free. But that's not what they mean by right to life. What do they mean by right to life? They mean you have the freedom to act in pursuit of the values necessary for your life based on whose judgment? Yours. Not based on state's judgment, not some authority's judgment, your judgment. And what does freedom mean? Because everybody out there in the world is for freedom. Everybody. I could speak in front of a group of communists and ask them, how many people here are for freedom? And every hand would go up. What does freedom actually mean? Not what the communists mean. It means the absence of coercion, the absence of force. So rights mean that you have the right, you have the freedom, which means no coercion, no force, to live your life as you see fit. With nobody has the ability to force you to do otherwise. That's what freedom means. That's what individual rights means. That's what this country was founded on. And that is only possible, as Thomas Jefferson will tell you, only possible for people who can reason, can use their mind, can discover truth, and therefore, talk about personal responsibility, can take care of themselves. Because the reality is, if we can't think, if we don't have a reason, if we don't have a mind, then we can't be responsible for ourselves. And indeed, in the past, you weren't expected to be. The Lord, the responsible for the manna, he took care of everybody, right? Because you couldn't take care of yourself. So the Enlightenment is a revolution that elevates reason. Once it elevates reason, who reasons? The individual. The individual becomes the unit, the end in itself. And therefore, individuals using reason must be free. And that's the political revolution of representational government. And the founders are not pro-democracy as we understand democracy in the sense of Greek democracy or really any other democracy. It's not about majority rule. Voting is not what makes America great. I know this is a shock to many audiences. Voting should be trivial. It shouldn't matter that much. Because the government, in the original intent, was small. It was limited. It couldn't do that many things. The possibility that the government and my life there would be an intersection was small. So who was in Washington? Didn't matter that much. The bigger the government becomes, the bigger the state becomes, the more we start caring. See, the more we talk politics, the more it's a sign our culture is deteriorated. Right? In a good culture, politics is like, one of the things we do, and once every 4 years we vote, big deal. No big deal. Right? The fact that it's so important that it animates everything in our world today means that that government is way too big, way too involved in our lives. But this idea of protecting minorities from the majority is what animates the Constitution. Because what is the smallest minority? What's the smallest minority in any country? The individual. What's the Constitution structured to do? Protect the individual from the majority. Why do we have individual rights? To protect us from a majority. They can vote to oppress us. And they do, and they have, and they still are. Right? So the Enlightenment brought us science, reason, individualism, and limited government. It's intellectually the greatest period of time, greatest period in, I think, human history. I think it's based almost exclusively on the ideas, ultimately, of the Greeks, primarily Aristotle and some other Greeks. It has led to the kind of flourishing we have today. It led to what some call the permissionless society that we benefited from in the early 19th century, at least somewhat, where you could go out, do what you wanted to do. It was none of anybody's business. Start any business you want. Invent anything you wanted without getting a permit. That, to me, is Western civilization. That's what created what we have today. And indeed, anybody who adopts reason, individualism, and political freedom is part of the West. Today, I think a country like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan are part of the West because they've adopted these ideas of Western civilization, imperfectly as they have. That's because we have them imperfectly. So Western civilization is a real set of ideas that were discovered during the Enlightenment, manifest themselves in the creation of the United States of America as the greatest achievement, manifest themselves in science and in technology and the success that we've had. It is a set of ideas that are worth fighting for. It is a set of ideas that liberates man and makes us wealthy and prosperous. And it's what we need to be fighting for rather than just fighting against. And these ideas are the best ideas. They produce the best results because they liberate the individual. And again, it doesn't matter where, it doesn't matter when. But when you liberate the individual, they will flourish. So, fighting for Western ideas, fighting Western civilization, is fighting for the Enlightenment. It's fighting for reason, individualism, and political liberty. And these ideas worth fighting for. These ideas that are important for our future. And ideas we are losing. Collectivism is on the rise. Irrationality, anti-reason is on the rise. And of course, as a consequence, as you lose reason and as you lose the individual, you lose political freedom. So political authoritarianism is on the rise, whether it's just the size of government, which is pretty authoritarian to begin with, or whether it's real authoritarianism where it wants to dictate everything we do. All of that is on the rise today. And I believe that it's on the rise primarily because we stopped defending the good. Bad, evil succeeds when the good stays silent, when the good refuses to fight. So, fight. Fight for the good. Fight for the West, not as a geography, but as an idea. Reason, individualism, and political liberty are worth that fight. Thank you.